Hello, everyone. Welcome back. We are ready to continue our crown training. Last time we kind of cut it a little bit shorter than we thought it was going to be. So it seems like this series is actually going to have a few more sessions than we originally planned for, but I think that's actually for the best because you get smaller chunks and can absorb more information that way anyway. So with that, let's kind of go ahead and get started with our next amplifier family. Today, that's going to be the CommTech Drive Tour series and the Drive Core Install series. The Drive Core Install series is huge. They're probably one of our more popular products. So most of our time today is actually going to be spent covering that. So let's get into it. The CommTech Drive Core series are amps. We don't receive a ton of calls on these. Because they're somewhat niche. I think they're often overlooked for multi-zone systems because they don't natively have 70-volt capability. But we do have a one rack unit 70-volt transformer kit for the 4 and 8 channel, or that have 4 and 8 channels. So it's two separate models. It's the XFMR4 and the XFMR8. The CT Drive Core series comes in 4 and 8 channel models, like I just said, and they have 75 and 125 watts per channel, depending on which version you get. The 150 in the naming scheme is because they're originally slated to be higher output. I had 150 watts, but kind of in the last hour of production, they decided that that wasn't going to be a sustainable output level, so they dropped the output to 125 watts and kept the name. It was going to be causing some overheating issues, especially since these amps don't have any sort of active cooling, no fans at all. They're completely passively cooled. These amps are also 2 ohms to 16 ohms stable, which is pretty impressive when you really think about it, that you can have 8 channels running at 125 watts each in one box with no fans. Surprisingly, one of the biggest applications for these amplifiers is digital organs. There's a company called Rogers out there, and I think there's a couple other ones that do it, but essentially what they do is they will have speakers tied to every output that reproduce a few of the horns a few of the pipes on a church organ. And apparently it works really, really well, so they've been doing it for a long time. Other applications are commercial install for multi-zone systems. You also see these in recording and broadcast due to the fact that they are fanless and have multi-zone systems. You see sometimes recording studios will use these in like 7.1 systems. They usually don't drive the subwoofers off of these, but you can still drive 7 channels separately, which will be a standard 7.1, or you can have a bunch of these and have an Atmos system for a smaller room. Some common support requests for these are related to output power. Like I mentioned earlier, the 4150 and the 8150 models are 125 watt per channels. People will often call asking why they're 125 watts instead of 150 watts. They will also call because they want to know what the output rating is at 2 and 16 ohms, because our website says that these amps are stable to 2 and 16 ohms, but if you look at the power chart for them, it only shows ratings for 8 ohms and 4 ohms. So I can tell you though that at 2 ohms and at 16 ohms, the output is halved, which means that for the 75 watt models, you're going to be looking at 37 watts per channel. And for the 125 watt models, you're looking at 62 watts per channel. The second issue is the unit will not power on. It's kind of I don't know, sometimes will happen in use, usually takes a few years to happen. It's referred to as the death loop by our techs and TJ. They do have a method of resetting this death loop without actually sending it in for service. A lot of times this is all they do when these amps actually go in, is they'll do this procedure and it'll start working again. And then they'll run their standard suite of tests to make sure that the amp is actually okay. But while I can give you that procedure here and it's outlined here, you probably don't want to give this to the majority of their customers because it will void their warranty. This is kind of something you reserve for someone who's absolutely desperate. They have an amp that's out of warranty. They need this thing right now, yesterday. They understand that this is going to void their warranty, but they want to try it anyway because they've got nothing else to lose. But if they do decide to do this, make sure that they're ready to pull the power really quickly, because if there's actually a physical hardware failure that caused this death loop to happen, then there's a chance it's going to output smoke and sparks and all that. So they'll want to be able to pull the power pretty quickly if this happens. But on the back of the unit, which maybe I'll kind of go back to, you're going to set your dip switches 2, 3, and 4 to the down position. Let's go back and take a look at that. Here's our dip switches here on the bottom left. Switches 2, 3, and 4, they will be set down, and then they'll go back up and back down within 15 seconds. Then you'll power the unit down from the front panel, or power the unit up from the front panel, and then the amplifier should boot or not. It's either going to throw off sparks or it's going to boot up normally, and they'll be able to use it again. But they definitely want to pay attention to it. Check with them for the impedance of any speakers that are attached on the line before you do this. Make sure everything else is squared away. And once again, I can't say this enough. You definitely do not want to do this unless it's someone who's like absolutely desperate. They're much better off sending it in for service 99% of the time. Common question number 3 is flashing ready lights. I get this one all the time. People will walk into a job or walk on site with one of these amplifiers, and they'll see that all the ready lights are just blinking steadily, like once a second or so, flash, flash, flash. And all that means is the amp is in sleep mode. It doesn't have any input, so it is a power saving amp. The power saving features kick in and it goes to sleep. As soon as you restore input to this amplifier, all the channels will wake back up immediately. Well, maybe not immediately. It takes about 4 seconds. So at that point, that'll go away. And if they want to disable that, then they just need to put dip switch number 2 in the on position, which will turn off the sleep. Then 70 volt capability questions. Like I said earlier in the intro, we have a 70 volt transformer kit for these amps. In fact, I'm gonna go ahead and show you guys what those look like. Wish we had a better picture of these, but essentially it's just a 1 rack unit box. If you were to take the top off, you would see 8 transformers inside of it. Let's see, maybe if we get a better picture on the cut sheet. Yeah, here we go. And then on the rear of the unit, you are presented with either 4 or 8 output terminals. 4 or 8 output terminals and input terminals. So essentially what happens here is we've got I'm sorry. Essentially what happens here is your input comes from the amplifier on the bottom and then goes out to the speakers on the top. So And these things actually come with jumpers to allow you to do this really quickly. They'll just ship right in the box, pre-wired. They already have the Phoenix connectors already on them. So if you buy one of these, it's a really quick swap to go to 70 volts. It doesn't take a whole lot of time stripping back wires and getting it ready for deployment. It's just ready to go right out of the box. Pretty cool, and I wish we sold more of these. They're a really cool system, and that a lot more of our customers should probably consider. I tend to recommend this system whenever you see a small business that has a bunch of zones split out using the inline volume controllers, especially one that's just recently failed. I'll say, yeah, get the CT475 and the XFMR4. That'll give you a proper 4-zone amplification system without having to use inline volume controllers that are eventually all going to fail. And if you guys have been paying attention to my previous training sessions, you know exactly how I feel about inline volume controllers. All right. Okay. Next, we're dealing with low output. This usually happens whenever someone has purchased this unit for home theater use, because they also want to use this or they also figured out that they could use this for a 7.1 system. I don't think it's a really good fit especially for low end home AV receivers, because they generally just don't have the output, and this amplifier does not have adjustable input sensitivity. We do have a consumer version of this amp. It's called the Lexicon DD8 and the DD8 Plus. The DD8 Plus specifically has RCA connectors on the input and DSP that you can use to preamplify a signal. In fact, I purchased one on the employee sale a year ago, and I love the thing for my own home theater. You also get the standard set of power draw questions you would find with any install amp, because this is, at the end of the day, an install amp. So I think I went over last time how you can identify or what kind of questions you should expect whenever people are asking about the power draw and thermal chart. Does anyone need me to go back over that today? All right, I guess I will move on. All right, on to our Big Daddy family, the DriveCore install series. So this is our flagship line of install amplifier product. They come in 3 variants, at least 3 current variants anyway. We've got one is the DCI analog series. These are fully analog input output amplifier for a simple and reliable installation where monitoring and DSP is not needed. Or DSP might be ahead of the amplifier. They've already got a DSP solution, like a BSS product, for example. 2 is the DCI DA series, and these are Dante enable amplifiers. They've got an extensive suite of DSP configuration, control, and monitoring available over IP using our Audio Architect software. They have 2 dedicated ports for redundant Dante input and output. And yes, they are capable of outputting Dante over the network as well as inputting. So you can use them to on-ramp Dante onto the network, and I'll show you guys how to do that later. Then the last current series is the DCI Network series, which is very similar to the DCI Dante series. It has the same control, configuration, and monitoring capabilities, but it trades the Dante ports for BlueLink ports instead. These amps actually showed up a bit before the the Dante series, but I believe the Dante series is quickly becoming a more popular amplifier for us. That said, we still have like thousands and thousands of these things out in the field currently, so we're going to cover these guys pretty extensively today. The DCI Dante series, or sorry, DCI Network series is also the only series that comes in the 2400 watt per channel output variants. Essentially, those guys are iTech 12,000s and iTech 4x3500s, but for the 2 and 4 channel output version. Conversely, there's also the discontinued network display series. I'm not going to display that here. We don't really take any calls on that one. But that one is an AVB variant and it has been discontinued, so we're not still selling it. I believe that the network series is getting ready to be discontinued, but for the moment we're still selling them and we still get a lot of support requests on them. So like I said, we're just going to go ahead and cover them today. The naming scheme on these amps is very similar to the CDI DriveCore series, as you can see. Essentially, you'll have the number of channels followed by the number of watts per channel on the amplifier. They are very, very similar to the CDI DriveCore series. They'll sound the same, because they're using the same technologies, but they're built a bit better and tested a bit better. The Network and Dante versions specifically are both EN 54-16 certified, which makes them suitable for life safety applications. This is critical for large venues and other applications that rely on their audio systems to direct crowds in the event of an emergency. This is kind of one of the primary reasons why the DCI series might be chosen over the CDI series, even though they're similarly equipped. They also have the ability to do pilot tone generation and monitoring. So you can detect problems on large 70 volt and 100 volt systems. Another quirk about this particular amplifier compared to every other one we've seen before is that these guys are made in Mexico, which makes them a lot easier to recommend and deploy in government and military installations. Anything coming from China or Malaysia will generally have to go through a lot more vetting and documentation. It's usually just harder to do, and oftentimes we'll lose business if we didn't have that capability. Let's see here. These amps get used in a huge variety of applications. The biggest one is obviously commercial install, but large venues, another place where we see these get used a lot, like stadiums. In fact, we just recently put, I want to say, a little over 400 of them into SoFi Stadium for the Los Angeles Rams and Chargers. I believe we also did the Las Vegas Raiders stadium with these amplifiers as well.
Yes, we did.
All right. You also see these being used in recording and broadcast. They're some of the amps that have the tunings capability for our M.2 and premium recording and broadcast speakers. You'll see them in houses of worship and cinema movie theaters, especially the Dante series now. Although originally it would have been the DCI network series because Dolby's version of Atmos originally was a collaboration with Harman using our BlueLink as the audio transport for all of the audio on your original Dolby Atmos movies. It was actually pretty cool. I set up a couple of those using the CP850 back when I used to do cinema installations. Okay, So let's start with the common support requests we receive for all of the families together. And then we'll kind of dive into which kind of requests we might expect to see from each particular family or iteration itself or variant. One of the biggest ones we get is a flashing blue power light. People will come and say it's not turning on, no power. It will be how it'll be represented to us often. And then upon further inspection, the blue power light's flashing. You can get some no power calls where they're just not getting anything at all too. And we kind of treat those the same way. But the first thing you'll want to do, especially with the flashing blue power light, is to do a cold reset. Where you're going to unplug the amplifier, let it sit for a while, an hour if you can, overnight if possible, at least an hour really, because a lot of times that will clear any capacitors and any kind of leftover, not sure what the word is, but any sort of leftover things that are still going on in the amp that might still have a bit of power in them from just transient power application still in there. If it doesn't recover, you can just do an RMA. The next common thing is no output, and this one mostly happens with the network models, including the Dante network add network display. Sometimes these amplifiers will be sort of corrupted. Their configuration file will end up being corrupted, and the first thing we do, well, we try to load a fresh configuration file on there by creating a virtual copy inside of Audio Architect. So let me go ahead and show you how that works. So got a DCI 4x600 DA. The symptom here, by the way, is whenever a customer is experiencing this, you actually see the input blocks going. In fact, I can launch virtual sound card to. You'll actually see the input blocks going, but on the output, you'll get nothing. And you can check the volume knobs on the back and make sure that those are fine, because those will also impact whether or not you'll see output. But otherwise, like everything will be like you'll see your ready lights are going, you're getting plenty of good input, but you get no blue bars on the output. And so that's the typical symptom that we're trying to correct here. So what I usually do is, I've got this amplifier here. I'll make them go offline. I will add another amplifier, just a virtual one. So this is a 4x600 DA. I would just go find our 4x600 DA. Open that amplifier. And save just a blank device file for it. All right, we've saved our device file, so we don't need this guy anymore. We can just kind of delete it. Now, while we're online with the amp, you can open it up. You can go to File, Open Device File, and load that device file we just made. And most of the time, this actually works just fine. If it doesn't, then there isn't a whole heck of a lot else we can do. There is one other thing we can try using by trying to force firmware to it using IQWiC, but that's a little bit more advanced, and it usually doesn't work anyway, so I'm not going to cover it right now, but if you would like to know more about it, go ahead and give me a shout, and I'd be happy to show you. And then we've got our common low output problems, which we get across all of our amplifiers. We actually get these kind of the least on this particular unit on the drive core install family because they are a bit more expensive, which tends to lead to more competent installers and more competent users who have spent a little bit more time learning the system and how it works. So while it's not common, we still do get them, and you want to know how to answer them. Essentially, usually low output is a result of low input. And the first thing you'll want to ask is, what kind of input source are you using? Can you turn the input source up? If the input source is turned all the way up, you want to have them look at the amp inside of Audio Architect. If it's a network model, and if it's not, then we're almost always looking at adding a preamp. But on the network models, you can do kind of the same trick that we've seen in some of the other amplifiers. Oops. Where we can open this guy up, enter the crossover, and then we can add up to 24 decibels of gain to the system. I usually start with 9 decibels because most of the time that's plenty. Again, we don't want to add too much here because we're going to be impacting our signal to noise ratio, which if we add a little bit too much, you're likely to get a hiss in the background in the output. So avoid that if possible. Only add as much gain at the preamp as you need, or at the crossover as you need, because it's not really a preamp. Okay. Okay. Now we're dealing with the factory reset. Factory resets can be pretty good tools for troubleshooting. In fact, I also use the factory reset sometimes whenever we're dealing with the no output issue, where you're seeing input, but on the output meters, you're not getting anything, and you verified everything else is okay. You can use this for, I mean, if someone's purchased an amp secondhand, or if just you've got a support question that just sounds weird and you just don't know another way to do it, you can usually use this. Or if you have an amplifier that has been locked inside of access control, so it'll show up on NetSetter as locked instead of discovered. Access control. So if we pop up NetSetter and choose our PC adapter, it'll say status discovered here. But if this ever says locked, then the only way to unlock that is to know the password for the access control, which will pop up a box asking you what that password is whenever you click on that amplifier in the list, or to do a full factory reset on the amplifier. How to load speaker tunings. So a lot of our JBL amplifiers will have a speaker tuning, and in fact, I kind of alluded to it a little bit earlier with the recording and broadcast speakers, especially things like the M2 and the LSR 700 series. So we get a lot of questions, or people are asking us how to use those things because they're just not familiar with loading them inside of Audio Architect. So with speaker tunings, you actually have 2 different versions of speaker tunings. One is a device file that overwrites everything on the amp. And more commonly on the DCI series, and I think this is kind of unique to them. It's one of the first times we actually had this, is a separate loadable speaker tuning, which you can, if you hit the file menu and open, you can open the speaker tuning file, or you can even save a speaker tuning file. So in this case, we're going to actually load a speaker tuning. It'll give us a warning about all of the speaker tunings changing. And I'll kind of go over what that means, but usually you're hitting yes because you know you have the speaker tuning file that you're actually looking for. Now, Audio Architect ships with a bunch of speaker tunings already for the DCIs, so it'll generally default you to this page where it's got all the speaker tunings preloaded. Why don't we go ahead and choose one here, the JBL M2. Now, it would look like nothing happened. Essentially here, we just would need to go into our actual speaker tuning channel or object here. That's what this guy last thing is here. And then you can hit recall and choose the speaker out of the list that you want. So if we're wanting to drive a M2 high frequency on channel 1 and then an M2 low frequency on channel 2, on the low frequency, it's asking us if we want a high pass filter or not. We'll just choose the no high pass. Then we can do that. And you'll notice immediately when you load these tunings, it'll lock the EQ, crossover, and delay properties for the entire amp. I think it should just lock the channels that are in question, or that actually you loaded the tuning on, but it locks it for all the channels because when you open the crossover, you can see some of the crossover parameters of the other channels all on the same page. So that's kind of why it does that. Conversely, let me bring that back over. If you have a speaker tuning that's a device file, again, a lot less common on the DCI series. You'll file, open, device file, and load that device file just like you would the speaker tuning. But the difference is that you will have to recall the preset that's got the specific tuning that you want. Usually they're named pretty well though. The speaker tunings option of the DCI series is nice though because it's universal to all of the amps, where if you have a speaker tunings device file, then it's only going to be specific to that particular amplifier. So the Dante tuning or Dante device file is never going to work on a network or network display, for example. Okay, this one is kind of a little bit of a doozy. This one kind of it sucks when you get it, but essentially what can happen is our amplifiers can load us and I mean, we'll notice a load short with some types of models, and it's almost always like 4 ohm or 2 ohm subwoofers connected on the output. So whenever the customer will call you and they'll tell you that they're getting the symptom of load short detected, or if it's on the analog series, you'll usually see it'll just have the ready light turn off on that amplifier or that channel for a few seconds and then comes right back on. And it'll constantly do this. You get the load short detected, it'll disable that output, and then it'll come back in a few seconds later. It's most likely to happen with like really bass heavy content or like kick drums or acapella. Really, a lot of these things are situations that would probably be resolved if they use the compressor. But generally speaking, they're calling you because they don't have that capability available. A few tricks you can do is you can try to set a high pass filter at 40 to 50 hertz, then and have them run it again It also doesn't happen on the DCI 4x2400 or 2x2400 models because they're a different type of amplifier. They're actually class BCA or class I, like our iTechs, rather than being a class D amplifier. Let's see. But we usually end up RMAing these at least once to rule out a hardware failure. Sometimes there is just a weird hardware failure on that amplifier. If it comes back to them and it's still doing this, then there really is no workaround other than to either add a compressor or try to get them into a different amplifier, usually something like the XTI series or any other amp that's got the required output power. But I usually don't recommend these amplifiers for subwoofers for this specific reason. We did have an escalation on it, but they essentially the answer was back that we got back was that it's not going to get fixed. It's a little too rare, a little too niche for them to worry about. I'd say we get this call once every 2 or 3 months. Firmware update failures, another one we get a lot. But this is actually common to pretty much all of our network amplifiers. I think that we get more calls about the DCI series on these because we are dealing with more savvy installers and users of the equipment. Who will want to make sure they're using the latest version or actually using Audio Architect. We see it less on the CDI series because it's got the display that's got so many of the options directly on a display. They don't have to connect it to a computer, so they don't get prompted with the firmware update message or look to update the firmware at all. So it's all, well, so whenever you get this, essentially what'll look like is they'll hit the update button on the amplifier on the firmware update page. It'll look like it's starting to update, but the bar will just not move. Eventually, it will time out and give a bunch of .NET related error codes, but it's the same thing. It's just saying that it can't open a socket to allow the transfer to go to happen. And it's almost always going to be some sort of firewall or network configuration issue. So what we will usually try to do is first tell the customer to disable their Windows firewall. That works, I would say, 90% of the time. Disable the Windows firewall, try running the software, the firmware update again. Then if that still doesn't work, it's almost always going to be like a managed switch or a router that is set to be blocking the TFTP transfers. TFTP is the file transfer protocol that the Audio Architect uses to transfer firmware to the amplifiers, and it's kind of an outdated one that, especially on like Windows 10 Home, is disabled by default. So a lot of switch manufacturers will kind of block it out of hand, or for managed switches and managed networks, they'll kind of just block that any type of TFTP transfer because it was commonly used for like transferring malware, and it's a lot of times how like worms and viruses will try to duplicate themselves on other machines across a network. It's also how a lot of like IoT, Internet of Things, viruses and attacks work. They'll use that same file transfer system. So it's understandable why a lot of networks just block this type of transfer altogether. So what I usually have our customers do is connect their Ethernet port from their PC directly to the input, the Ethernet port of the amplifier, and that will resolve this issue 100% of the time. Well, 99.999%, sometimes the customers will have some issue with their own computer that may be blocking this, but at that point, it's not it's not going to be something that's related to Audio Architect or the amplifier, it's really going to be isolated to their computer. So if that does happen, tell them to try another PC. Not retaining power state after power outage happens because of a firmware that is on the power supply. Amps that were produced around mid to late 2018, maybe early 2019. I think even early 2018 probably is affected. They can all have this issue. So the amplifier will be on. They will switch it off with the mains, like just from a power outage, or if they're using a power sequencer, which is really common in large venues. They'll just cut power to these things essentially at a breaker. Then when they are turning everything back on, they'll add power to them. They should return back to the same power state they were when the amp was when the amp lost power. But these amplifiers aren't doing this. So to fix that, they actually need to send the amp in for service. It's not field serviceable. The power supply needs to be have a firmware update applied to it using a Cortex adapter and a Cortex adapter in our special software. I can give you guys that firmware update if you guys want it. I imagine most of you guys don't have a Cortex adapter, but it is actually detailed in our media library under TechNote 233. Okay. Another common call is people want to know how to connect these things with our Contrio wall controllers. I don't really recommend it because you're controlling the amp directly. And I don't know if you guys, so how many of you guys were in our first session, but controlling the amp directly and controlling the volume of your output directly at the amp, I think, is usually a bad idea because you're going to potentially run into issues where the amplifier is going to be sending more power to than the speakers can handle, and which can lead to blown speakers. That said, there are ways to do this relatively safely. So by setting a limiter. But if the customer knows what they're doing and wants to do it this way, then let's see here. To go to ESS, C4PV. Essentially, we will just want to open up the wall controller. Then we'll also want to open up our amp at the same time. And you can hold control and drag the element that you want to control into the amp. So if I want to control channel 1's gain, I can just kind of control and drag that to the fader segment here. Then I can control and drag maybe the mute if they were to push the encoder. And I can either put the input or the output. Usually you're going to want to drag over the output meter so they can see what kind of output the amp is reporting directly on the meter. Okay. And that's a single zone system. Usually you're going to see this more in a 4-zone system. So in which case I'll push button 1 for the main dining room, button 2 for the bar, etc. Once again, I drag that over, mute, output meter. Go to zone 2 and do the same thing. Meter. So on and so forth. Pretty straightforward. If they're going to do this, like I said, especially if they're not for a like 8 ohm or 4 ohm, 2 ohm, a low impedance system, they're going to want to set the limiters. So figure out exactly how much power that system can handle and hop over to the limiter settings. Open your limiter wizard and then enter those numbers that will protect the system. I pretty much always just do the RMS number and let everything else be handled manually, or handle automatically, I mean. Don't forget to turn your limiter on as well. Okay. And we've got power questions. Yeah, we got the standard install amplifier. Well, how much power is this going to use? How many of these can I put on a circuit? Type of questions. And then like the CDI Drive Core series, we're also going to get occasionally get these questions about the IAC connector that's on the back. It comes with the IAC C20 connector on for some of the bigger modules like the 4x1250, 8x300, 600, and 2 and 4x20, well, 2x2400 will all have this particular connector on there. And people will think that they were shipped a cable with from the wrong country, which is not true. It's just you were shipped a 20 amp cable rather than a 15 amp cable, due to the output levels or the wattage requirements of this particular socket. Basically, this is something that you really only see in the U.S. because we have 120 volts. I imagine they also see this in Japan, wherever they've got 100 volts using their own 100 volt connector. But it's something to keep in mind. We get this kind of call all the time. If they're going to replace the cable with a standard 15 amp plug, that's doable, but they have to know their actual use case. They need to know that, well, I'm going to be using 3 channels and they're going to be running at 8 ohms. So you'll want to go into the power draw and thermal chart. So why don't we go ahead and do just a little bit of a, say 4x600, oh, sorry, 4x1250 DA. Find our power draw and thermal. Actually, I think the 4x12, the DA series doesn't have a power chart yet. And actually, this is a good point. Since the DA series doesn't have its own power draw and thermal chart, it's actually identical to the network series, which does have it. Yeah. 56. So we're looking for the 4x1250. Here we go. If we were going to use 3 channels at 8 ohms each, and the 4th channel was just not going to be used, we can kind of infer that this amplifier is going to draw 8 amps from the wall. That's assuming all 4 channels are being used. So you take 75% of 8. And that's only going to be drawing 6 amps. So that should easily be able to accommodate a standard 15 amp circuit. Actually, I just did use the bridge numbers rather than the dual numbers. That'd be 8.3. Again, 6 1/4 essentially, just around 6 1/4 amps from the wall. So it would fit inside of a 15 amp circuit. It would actually be okay to use one of these types of cables to do this. That's where it's got that C19 connector on there. C19 connector and the NEMA 5-15P, which is the standard grounded US 120 volt plug. All right, I think that's it for common questions for like the entire DCI series. Now we're gonna go into some of the more specific questions you'll get for each particular series. So let's start with the analog. The DCI analog series is pretty simple, which tends to cut down on a number of configuration related support requests. But there are a couple common ones. The first is related to the 70 volt operation of these amps. Enabling 70 volt is pretty simple, but a lot of customers will still ask about it. Essentially, what we're going to want to do first is check the global settings switches, which are found kind of on the left side of the amp. The global settings switches will determine whether the amp is going to be in 70 volt mode or 100 volt mode. You can have the amplifier do one or the other, but not both. So like you can have several channels 1 and 2 be at 70 volt and channels 3 and 4 be at 8 ohms, but you can't have channel 1 be at 70 volt, channel 2 be at 100 volt. That will not work. The entire amp has got to have the same voltage whenever it's in the high Z mode. Let's see. Then once you've verified the global setting switch for each channel that needs to be in 70 or 100 volt mode, you'll want to set the high Z switch for that channel in the up/on position. And this, we're looking at a 4-channel amp right here. So if we wanted channels 1 and 2 to be in 70 volt mode, then we would just turn high Z on. We'll flip these two switches to be in the on position. Any channels we don't want to have 70 volt, you'll just leave down. If the customer wants to bridge to 140 volts or 200 volts respectively, then they're going to need to have both of those channels high Z switches on as well as the bridge switch. So if they wanted 140 volts, then they would need to have the global switch A set in the down position for 70 volt, then have high Z1 and high Z2 up, as well as bridge 1 plus 2. And that will make that output 140 volts. Next, specific to the DCI analog series, the analog inputs are permanently tied to their output channel. There's no configuration switches that allow anything fancy or any sort of signal routing for them. So that means that they have to be all manually wired up. So if you're only bringing a mono input source into this amplifier, then you have to jumper that input to every output that actually needs to play or to receive that signal. So essentially, let's use a wire here. I have a pen. I can draw this for you. Let's call this our input cable. It's got a positive, a negative, and a ground coming in. But we want to get the signal to every output, or multiple outputs at least. So you're going to need to make a jumper to every single channel. Negative, again for positive. It's again for the ground. This amp also doesn't have any sort of summing capability, so the signal needs to come in mono already. Um, you don't want to do a situation where you've got like a stereo input source and you need mono outputs. They really need to be summing this ahead of time of the amp. I mean, ahead of the amp, and rather than trying to do this with jumpers, they can also use a like a summing cable that already has resistors between the positives, but just putting two positives, like a left positive and right positive, into channel one, for example, while it might work and sound fine, is generally pretty bad. You're going to be phasing out a lot of the signals, as well as potentially giving yourself a situation where you could damage your input device. Okay. So I have this page added twice. Okay. Now, coming to the, let's move on to the DA series. Specific requests for the DA series generally are limited to, well, are assigning channels with Dante. It's actually pretty straightforward and simple. Let's go ahead and kind of show you how that works. So we've got, that takes two parts. You've got Dante controller, and you've got the amplifier and audio architect. So an audio architect, you're going to want to, you probably want to start with audio architect. I guess you could start with Dante controller, but it doesn't really matter. Let's go ahead and start with a fresh amplifier. Clear everything. But you want to open up your input block, and we're going to notice here under network signal status, we've got an input A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and H. That kind of will apply to channels 1 through 8 as far as Dante receivers. Right now we don't have an input source, so that's why it shows the blocks, but I can launch Dante virtual sound card and take care of that in a second. Transmit 1 and 2. So launch Dante virtual sound card so I can use my computer as an input source. And we have made some roots here. Here we go. Here we go. All right. So you can see I've essentially routed my left channels to all the odd numbered inputs, and my right channel, channel 2, to the even numbered inputs. So if I were to play something on YouTube, oh, it's YouTube ads. So we should now be actually receiving input on the amp. And we can, so input A is getting our left, input B is getting our right, input C is getting the left again, so on and so forth, left and right. So if I wanted channel 1 to be receiving the left signal, I could just go to Dante input A as a medium or a high source. By default, it's going to be listening to input A. So that's already set. But if I do have a source that's like this, where it needs to, where I need to have this be mono, I could actually come in here and say that I want it to be A plus B. And now I'm receiving both the left and the right as a mono output. This is a really common thing people ask us to help them set up all the time. The other thing is Dante firmware updates. Let's go ahead and stop that. Oh, actually, before we do Dante firmware updates, yeah, let me talk about analog on-ramp. So I mentioned this earlier. You can use the analog inputs on all of our Dante amplifiers to on-ramp Dante onto the Dante network. So if you wanted to send your signal to a DSP before having it output from the amp, you could, or if you just needed more inputs to the Dante network, then you can as well. Another common use for this is for if you've only got one set of inputs, one set of analog inputs, but you want to send that to multiple Dante amplifiers, that's also something that can be done. And it's pretty straightforward. Let's go ahead and get Audio Architect back up. Do this, we'll want to open up our input block. Then we want to go to output configuration. And we want to, so these audio sources all refer to channels 1 through 8 on the transmitter and Dante controller. So as you can see, Dante refers to this amp as both a transmitter and a receiver. So if we're outputting, then we're using the transmit channels, and that's what these 1 through 8 correspond to. So if I had analog 1 tied up, input tied to analog 1, and I wanted to send that to all of our channels. There actually wouldn't be much of a reason to send to all channels, but we can do that if we wanted to. Now, any analog input I put into channel 1 is going to show up as a transmitter, and I can send that to any devices that have receivers. So if I wanted to send analog input 1 to my computer using Dante Virtual Sound Card, I could now do that. I'll just find this transmitter and my receiver point. I'll send that to channel 3 of my Dante Virtual Sound Card. Now I'm set up to run that analog audio from the amp into my computer or to any other Dante receiver on the network. Okay, upgrading Dante firmware is sometimes required, especially if it's an older system. Also, occasionally we will send out amplifiers that have incorrect Dante firmware. Unfortunately, it happens a little bit more often than we'd like, but it does happen. We need to know how to take care of it. So the first thing you want to do is make sure that you're running the latest version of Audio Architect. That's 2.45.2. You can check the version by hitting the File menu, and you can see right here in the bottom corner of the File menu the current version, 2.45.2. I think .12 is the latest version. And from there, you'll want to make sure your Dante, your Audio Architect firmware, the amplifier firmware is up to date. So we'll open up the firmware updater, and we can see that our DCI-DA has the most current version available. So no need to update there. Is that? But if it wasn't the latest version, we would need to update that. So next, we actually need to open up Dante Updater, which is found in Dante Controller, which I accidentally closed. There's a symbol right here for Dante Updater. So we're looking for an amp, and usually you'll find it inside of under up to date, but you want to pay attention to the manufacturer here. And I kind of left this one specifically unupdated just because to show you. If it says Harman International, it's actually running the incorrect firmware. Sometimes it works anyway, but if you expand it, you'll kind of see it's going to be talking about a Soundweb London Dante image for a Blue 806, 326, and Blue Dan. Like, that's wrong. That can actually lead to a lot of problems. As far as routing, sometimes you'll end up with issues where you'll be able to route like the first 2 channels in Dante, but every other channel in Dante doesn't work. Weird Dante issues like that, or if you verify that the network is fine, you've tried to make direct connections, and you're still not able to pass audio, a lot of times this is the reason why is because you're using the wrong Dante firmware. So we're going to go ahead and update it. I'm going to go ahead and show you how to update that. It's a little bit of a process. First thing we're going to need to do is find our image file inside of, or Dante firmware file inside of our Audio Architect installation. So, but we actually need to prep Dante Updater to do that. So you want to go to the advanced settings here using the hamburger on the right. Then make sure that allow imported firmware is checked. So you're going to allow imported firmware, and then also to allow override of device matching, because right now this device thinks it's a Blue 806 or a Soundweb London product. So we need to tell it that it's not. We need to tell it to allow it to override whatever it thinks it is. So hit apply, make sure that's good there. Not sure why that went away, but we'll come back here in a second. Gary, I know we're at bed over time. This is just kind of a big series, so I think we still have another probably 15 to 20 minutes worth of content to cover here.
Okay, no problem.
If you run into this issue where the Dante firmware is not showing up, you can just reboot the amp and it usually comes right back up. Live troubleshooting. This is another actual issue that mostly happens because it's on the wrong firmware. Okay, so we're going to want to import our actual Dante file. And once again, I said you have to make sure that you're on the latest version of Audio Architect, because if you're on some of the other versions like 2.45.1, those actually have incorrect firmware files that will make things work. So they'll actually reverse the Dante ports. They'll make the primary port into the secondary and the secondary port into the primary. And this is a huge headache, so you don't want to go through that. So make sure you're just using the latest version of Audio Architect. You'll want to click on Imported Files, import the firmware, navigate to your Audio Architect folder, which is under Program Files, Harman Pro, Audio Architect, and then firmware updates. Now these firmware files are amplifier specific. I have a DCI 4x600 DA here, so I want to make sure that I choose the correct file. Okay, and now we can see that we've got our file imported. And we can go back to home screen. We're imported firmware files. Now we can see our DCI amplifier again. You want to expand it and tell it that you want it to override the firmware. And we give you a kind of a warning message. We're going to go ahead and push through anyway. Once again, one other checkbox that you have to hit, and then you can start the update process. If this is moving super slow, it's probably going to fail. And the biggest reason for that is the amplifier needs to be rebooted after a firmware update for the main amplifier firmware. This is moving pretty quickly, so I think this is going to work fine. And once it's done, it's going to prompt us to manually reboot the device. And you're actually going to want to do that, power cycle it completely. Cool, manual reboot required. Do that. Back on. All right. Once we're done here, this should change from saying Harman International to Crown. For a brief second, it'll come back up. It's still booting. Eventually it'll come back up. This actually does take a while sometimes. I'm not sure why, but it is. I'm gonna relaunch a Dante updater just because we don't have a refresh on it. Once we're done, it'll show up here under up to date as a Crown rather than just under imported firmware files only. It's a little strange it's not showing up. Well, I think you're gonna have to take my word for it because it's showing up here, but it'll look exactly like this, just on the up-to-date line rather than under imported firmware files only. It's possible that there was a recent update to the Dante updater, and that's why it's not showing up here, but it looks like it's actually discovered the amp. So let's go ahead and move on. But we can see that we're good inside of Audio Architect now. I mean, inside of Dante Controller now. It's seeing the amplifier, seeing all of our inputs, and it should allow us to actually transmit audio properly now if we want. No Dante audio. I honestly, I really strongly recommend everyone take the Dante Audinate level 1 and 2 trainings courses. Level 3 is good too, but it's really more about networking and advanced configurations than it is about Dante itself. Most of the questions that we'll get will be inside the level 2 knowledge, and the calls that'll take you these are actually the calls that'll take you the longest to troubleshoot. Because a lot of times they'll be firmware related, but they can also be network related. So if you're not able to get Dante audio to the amp, and you've updated the firmware and you have verified all the connections, you're almost always looking at some sort of network issue, and the customer will oftentimes swear up and down that they have done everything necessary. Their network is good. They don't have access to the switches, but regardless, they'll think that their setup is good, but it's still not transferring audio. So what I usually tell them at that point is to get a dummy switch, because these are almost always being deployed on managed networks. So get a dummy switch and plug all your Dante equipment together using a dummy switch, and see if that doesn't resolve the issue and have it show up correctly and allow you to make routes inside of a Dante controller. Sometimes you'll even have it set up where you can actually see all of the routes set inside of Dante controller, but as soon as you actually start trying to pass audio, the audio doesn't work. Again, that can be a firmware issue or a network issue. And the only way to know if it's a network issue is to try on a completely unmanaged network. Also, you'll want to have them try things like checking all their IP addresses. Like if they have used a static IP scheme for all of their Dante ports, we can actually go into the device configuration, select our device, then we can go to the network config tab. Try having them put everything on a separate network, dummy switch, and then have all of the IPs addressed automatically rather than using manually configured static IPs. Just to confirm that they're not actually running or having some issues based on like subnet masks or IPs that are overlapping each other from another device on the network. That's why I'll just say, just let it be all redundant. Really, realistically, with Dante, there's not that much of a need to do anything other than automatic IP address networking, but a lot of network administrators want all static IP addresses for all of the devices on the network, and you'll end up with problems like these. You can also get Dante Virtual Sound Card like I've got here. Plug that directly into one of the Dante ports of your amplifier. Whenever you use Dante Virtual Sound Card, you'll end up with a screen like this here. You can go into your sound settings on your computer and you'll see the DVS transmit. Just set it to transmit 1 and 2 as your main output device. start playing audio on YouTube, just similar to what you've seen me do. Make sure that your virtual sound card is actually started, and it will show up inside of Dante Controller. If that works, then it's going to be something network related. And there's unfortunately not going to be any real arguing on that, because if it was working directly with Dante Virtual Sound Card, then every other Dante should work. It's going to be something external to the system. This one's less common. If the customer is complaining of audio dropouts, clocking issues are the likely cause. And specifically, if we're, well, with clocking issues, you just kind of want to have them choose a preferred clock master. Usually you'll see that inside of Dante Controller. Let's see here, if we go to our main page, network status, we'll usually see issues like with high latency. Like right now, they're saying this is a fairly high latency at 6 milliseconds. I think if we refresh, it probably goes away. Yeah. But yeah, these types of things can lead to popping noises, in which case you would kind of want to set a clock master. You do that under device view. Actually, I don't remember where right off the top of my head. Oh, here we go. Okay. So you would just kind of choose preferred master, and for one of the devices that's kind of central to the whole system. Usually, if you're going to be running into clocking issues, it's going to be on a very large installation where they've got several different hubs of audio, like stadiums and such. So you'll kind of want to set one device to be a master, and usually it'll be a DSP. If they're working with a system that has both BlueLink and Dante in the same system, like where they're using like a Blue DAN or a Blue 806, you'll want to set the device that is handling that, both the BlueLink and the Dante, as the master, because a lot of times you'll run into an issue where there is popping noises, and it's going to be, and you've got this Blue 806 in the system, or a Blue DA in the system. So you'll kind of want to set them both to be the master. So let's see if I can show you here in Audio Architect. Add a Blue DAN. Opening its default control panel. You will set, it says 254 is the high. So you want to set this to be the highest priority for BlueLink mastering, or for BlueLink clocking. And then you would go into Dante Controller, find it in this clock status list, and also set it as the preferred clock master. That pretty much always gets rid of that problem. Another thing we do is we recommend isolating Dante on separate hardware, or at the very least a separate VLAN. That can also help with any sort of popping. If there's just too much traffic on some of the network hardware, we'll see this sometimes in like hotels, where they will have their customer Wi-Fi system also tied into the same hardware that's running their Dante audio. and that will cause problems. So we'll tell them, yeah, get a separate hardware. They usually have separate VLANs, but the hardware can only handle so much traffic. And if it's a busy night, a full hotel, or a big conference or something, if they're not running separate hardware, or switches that have really good processing, then they might still run into this. All right, let's move on to the network series. So we're running a little late here. Assigning BlueLink channels, just like the Dante series, people will want to understand how to assign BlueLink channels. We've got a DCI 8600N set up here. It works very similarly, but you'll kind of have to already understand how BlueLink works coming from a DSP. So as long as we know which channels we need to assign, it's pretty straightforward. We'll just open up our input block. And under our network signal status, we're going to choose the BlueLink channels that we want to output from the amp. So if we know that we've got 4 channels of audio coming from our DSP from channels 5 through 8, we can actually type that in. Channel 5, channel 6, channel 7, and channel 8. Then if we know that channel 5 and 6 are actually a stereo signal that we want to sum down into mono, fairly rare use cases, usually you'll do that at the DSP, but sometimes you'll need that. You can do the same thing where you can just say, I want to use BlueLink inputs A and B together. And that'll sum those 2 inputs into a mono signal. And now we're outputting that stereo signal as mono from that output. Also, like the Dante series, you can use the analog inputs of the DCI network series as an on-ramp to the BlueLink network. It works very similarly. You're going to open up the input configuration block again. You're going to hit output configuration. And then you're going to choose, like, all of these audio sources we can assign. So it's a little bit different than Dante. We're just going to say which analog inputs we're going to want to use. 2, 3, 4. This is actually a bit more commonly done than with Dante, but so it's a good thing to learn here. So we've assigned all of our analog input sources to a output. Now we're going to open up the audio routing tab, and we're going to choose which channels on the BlueLink bus we're going to specifically assign to. So I want to put these on 17 through 24. So I can select all of them and move them over that way, or I could even select them individually. Like if I know I can move channel 2 over to input 10, for example. You can only assign the input once though. So if you change that that assignment, then it's going to move over. You hit OK, and you're good to go. And this actually, like I did this offline, but this would actually have to happen online, otherwise it wouldn't actually apply. Conversely, you can go online and hit send, and that'll do the same thing. If the customer is complaining of no BlueLink audio, they just can't get it on from their DSP, or they're transferring audio using an on-ramp from another amp to get to the to multiple amplifiers. There's a couple different reasons why that might happen. Usually the most common reason is they just didn't do the configuration properly. They haven't gone in here and allowed the amplifier to be listening for those channels. So this is the first spot you want to check, is in your network signal status, and then have each check to make sure that each channel is applied to the channels that they want to listen to. This will usually require some knowledge of the BSS processors, because this will almost always you'll almost always have to go into like a Blue 100 or another Soundman London processor and figure out which channel that they're trying to actually listen to and output from. So definitely go ahead and take the Audio Architect training series if you haven't already. Okay. The other thing that happens on these guys is sometimes, or really with any BlueLink device, whether it's a DSP or an amplifier, is that the BlueLink ports can actually go bad. And so you'll want to have the customer look at all of the, or physically inspect all of the BlueLink ports and their connections to see if they're getting blinking lights on their inputs and outputs. One test you can also do is just take a short piece of Cat5 and wire the input of an amp directly to its own output and see if you get lights on both. If I were to do that on this amp, find a piece of Cat5 here. I can even see the BlueLink status lights pop up inside of the device preferences or the default control panel. Yep. And we can see that we've got BlueLink lights on the in and the out. They're green. So you want to look for that. If you do end up finding, so it oftentimes just end up being where you have to figure out which device has actually gone bad. And one kind of hint that you're dealing with a dead BlueLink device is, or a dead BlueLink port, is that like most of the BlueLink audio will be working, but suddenly like 3 or 4 amplifiers or 3 or 4 devices stopped outputting. Essentially what would have happened is, since BlueLink is in a chain, you lost the output port on one of those devices or the input port on one of those devices, and that's where the chain ended up stopping. You can temporarily just have them delete that device out of the BlueLink chain, just remove that device, plug the output of the previous device into the input of the next device, and continue the chain that way. Temporarily while they're getting this amplifier repaired or whatever BlueLink device it is repaired. But again, this can be an amplifier, a DSP, or like a bib or a bob. If you're all right, and that kind of ends our DCI series here. Does anyone have any specific questions for me? Let's try to limit it to the DCI series today. I'm not sure how many people are actually in here today.
We have about a half dozen.
Okay.
So. Anyone have any questions? You can either hit the chat or unmute and ask. All right. Well, this will be posted here shortly. Probably it takes about a week or so, but it'll be posted out on the knowledge base. And if you need to access it, you can access it from there.
Harry, just a
Yes.
question, not specific about the training, but there will be this training will be for this training. This training have a certificate?
It doesn't necessarily have a certificate, but we do turn around and we keep track of everybody that participates on the regional training, so that information can be passed on to the different locations and managers and that kind of thing.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
All right. Okay. If nothing else, then I'm going to stop the recording and we'll call it.
All right.